It's good to see each of you here this evening. In 2014, ISIS attacked a village of Kurdish-speaking Yazidis in Iraq. Nadia Murad was 21 at the time, and she was taken into a slave market in Mosul and bought by a judge whose job involved condemning people to death for minor offenses. The judge raped Nadia daily. He beat her when she displeased him. When she tried to escape, he allowed his guards to gang rape her. He said, "You're my fourth Sabiya slave." He said, "The other three are Muslim now. I did that for them. Yazidis are infidels. And that's why we are doing this. It's to help you." You hear that, and you recoil with horror and disgust. But the judge's actions were not unjust according to his own personal moral code. ISIS has a research and fatwa department that had studied the Yazidis and concluded that they were non-believers and that their enslavement was justified under Sharia law. They published a booklet called Questions and Answers on Taking Captives and Slaves that gave their fighters guidelines. Here are some of their examples. Question: is it permissible to have intercourse with a female slave who has not reached puberty? Answer: it is permissible to have intercourse with a female slave who hasn't reached puberty if she is fit for intercourse. Question: is it permissible to sell a female captive? Answer: it is permissible to buy, sell, or gift female captives or slaves, for they are merely property. The plan to eradicate the Yazidis are two-pronged: to kill men and older women, and to rape and enslave the young women. The men of ISIS were fulfilling not just their desires, but also what they believed was their religious duty. There are problems with the claim that religion hurts morality. This series that I'm giving on the second Sunday night of the month, Modern Challenges to Ancient Faith, is designed to help us see what's going on in the world and the criticisms that people are offering against Christianity, and what the truth is and what our response might be. Doug mentioned in his prayer just a moment ago that we might be lights shining in a very dark world. This is one aspect of allowing our light to shine. One of the criticisms of Christianity or religion in general is that we can be moral without it. In 1999, Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg made this claim: religion is an insult to human dignity. With or without it, you would have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion. Now, there have been clearly a lot of evil perpetrated in the name of different religions and even in the name of Christianity in the broad sense of the word. But there are three problems with the claim that religion hinders morality. First of all, the problem is a lack of specificity. There are a lot of religions out there. And religion is an all-encompassing term, of course, that stretches from ISIS, maybe on one end of the spectrum, to the Amish on the other end of the spectrum. from offering pagan child sacrifices to Buddhist meditation. So we can make a statement that socialism hinders morality. And there is a clear connection between socialism and the Marxist philosophy that motivated Joseph Stalin and his evil acts. But even that statement is far too broad. So to make any meaningful statement about religion and morality, we have to be more specific. The second criticism, the second problem with the claim that religion hinders morality is that it does not fit what the data shows. I had a whole series of sermons, you remember, a few years ago on how Christianity has impacted our society for the better. There's substantial evidence that religious practice correlates with a range of moral good. This book was published in 2018, 3 years ago, The Character Gap, How Good Are We?, written by philosopher Christian Milner. And he observed that literally hundreds of studies link religious participation with better moral behavior. For example, sociologists Christopher Ellison and Kristen Anderson discovered that levels of domestic violence in the United States sample were almost twice as high for men who did not attend religious worship services versus those who attended at least once a week. Religious participation has been linked to lower rates of 43 different crimes. The fact is, people who practice religion in the broad sense of the word are better quality citizens. In North America, regular service attenders donate 3.5 times the money given by non-religious counterparts per year, and Christians volunteer twice as much as those who claim no religious affiliation. An atheist social psychologist, Jonathan Haidt, warns, even if you excuse secular liberals from charity because they vote for government welfare programs, it's still awfully hard to explain why secular liberals give so little blood. That is, in helping those who need help. The third problem with the claim that religion hinders morality cuts even deeper. It assumes that there is a universal standard, a universal measuring stick for morality. Some self-evident truths in the moral realm that applies to everybody and that everybody can agree on. Well, what about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Some leftists say, well, we've got this Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and if everybody just lives by that, we don't have to have religion. The composition and the widespread adoption of this document was, in fact, an extraordinary achievement for human beings. But it was not done without a theological foundation. Now, many of us were not alive in the 1940s when this was written. Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the committee. She claimed to be a devout Christian motivated by her faith. Charles Malik represented the nation of Lebanon, which is majority Muslim, but he himself was a Greek Orthodox. And he claimed to be strongly motivated by his faith. Now, despite the Chinese representative, Ping Chun-Kang's insistence that all direct references to God be removed from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it has been criticized because of its Judeo-Christian influence. While most Muslim countries signed that declaration back in 1948, Saudi Arabia did not. The Saudi government argued that the declaration violated Islamic law and failed to accommodate the cultural and religious context of non-Western societies. In 1982, Iran's representative deemed the declaration a secular understanding of the Judeo-Christian tradition and that it would not be implemented by Muslims. and did not accord with the system of values recognized by the Islamic Republic of Iran. In other words, even people cannot agree on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a standard of morality. And in fact, the problem of universalizing human rights is limited to just traditional Islam. North Korea is officially atheist, and they top the list of human rights abuses. China is officially atheist. India, majority Hindu, is generally at the top of the watch list for violating human rights. So where are we going to get a source for some standard of behavior? The idea that all human beings should be valued equally was far from the norm even in the ancient world. In Greek and Roman thought, free men had more inherent dignity and worth than women and slaves and children. Disabled infants were generally left outside, exposed to the elements to be allowed to die. Early versions of abortion. Plato and Aristotle supported direct eugenics, modifying people to the degree they could. They didn't understand genetics obviously as well as we do. Aristotle declared, "Let there be a law that no deformed child shall live." That was Aristotle. Into that world, into that moral culture, stepped this first century Jewish rabbi who elevated women, who valued children, who loved the poor, and who embraced the sick. And the early Christian emphasis on brotherhood, we know, crossed racial and ethnic boundaries, even crossing the boundary between a master and a slave. And it sparked the beginning of the fall of the Roman Empire. And it ignited a new moral sense in humanity as a whole. Values that many of us in the United States and the West consider to be universal and independent of religious thought actually turns out to have sprung from Christianity during the days of the Enlightenment. And they've grown and spread because of Christian influence. To be sure, there are many secular scholars have attempted to establish a basis for human rights that is completely disconnected from religion, specifically Christianity, of course. In the book Humanism and the Death of God, philosopher Ronald Osborne surveys some recent forays into that idea of having some standard of morality without having a religion, specifically Christianity, tied to it. And he concludes that core humanistic values of inviolable human dignity, inalienable human rights, and intrinsic human equality cannot be upheld by a scientific naturalism. Nature itself would ultimately crumble into the idea that there is no law. This man, again, is an atheist who recognizes that without some basis, anything goes. He says they must be sustained by a vision of personhood such as the one found in the historically unprecedented way in Christianity. Osborne locates this view not just in the belief that humans are made in the image of God, which is a very old biblical teaching, right, from the book of Genesis, but also in the specifically Christian belief that God became flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. That a poor manual laborer from a defeated backwater country of the Roman Empire who was tortured to death by the political and religious authorities of the day would create a moral value system that is still the best system to live by. Now, when it comes to a robust philosophical foundation for human rights, from a secular perspective, the building materials are hard to come by. How are you going to create a moral system when you take the existence of God and the nature of Jesus Christ out of the picture? We can invoke sociological and economic data to argue that societies seem to thrive when a higher value is placed on human life and when human equality is upheld. But that's pragmatic. That's not a moral argument. When you reject a Christian foundation for human rights, you see the position that the late atheist Christopher Hitchens says. He's not an atheist anymore because he's dead. He said, "How do I know there are such things as human rights? I don't know there are such things. Our grounding for human rights is about as tenuous as our position as a primate species on a rather dodgy planet. There are no human rights. If there is no God, there is no human rights." Let me introduce you to Sarah, who grew up in Australia in a loving, non-religious home. By the time she went to Sydney University, she was a critic of Christianity. She showed up for grad school at King's College in Cambridge, and so she fit right in. King's College, I have heard, is the California of Cambridge colleges. In other words, known for its party culture and its liberal politics. The smattering of self-professed Christians at King's College made no dent in the anti-religious fervor that swept through the student body. So Sarah remained comfortable in her atheism. But there was a bizarre twist of fate that led her from Cambridge to Oxford. And she attended a series of lectures by a famed atheist philosopher by the name of Peter Singer, also from Australia, who taught, maybe still teaches, at Princeton. Singer is one of the rare secular philosophers who face atheism's lack of grounding for human equality dead on. Rather than basing human worth on the unique status of human beings as Homo sapiens, Singer argues that beings should be valued according to their capacities, their self-awareness, their ability to suffer, and so on. Based on that reasoning now, Professor Singer says a week-old baby is not a rational and self-conscious being, and there are many non-human animals whose rationality, self-consciousness, awareness, and capacity, and so on, exceed that of a human baby, a week or a month old. Professor Singer is on record as promoting the infanticide, which is what we would call it, of babies that are a week or a month old. Even after they're born, they're not self-conscious yet, and so therefore they're not human yet. That's Professor Singer's position. Sarah heard Professor Singer lecture on that type of thing. And she experienced, as she writes in her book, what she calls a strange intellectual vertigo. She said, "I was committed to believing that universal human value was more than just a well-meaning conceit of liberalism. But I knew from my own research that societies have always had different conceptions of human worth, or lack thereof. The premise of human equality is not a self-evident truth. It is profoundly historically contingent." She said, "I began to realize that the implications of my atheism were incompatible with almost every value I held dear." One afternoon, Sarah was studying in the library, and she realized that the desk where she was studying was located in the theology section of Oxford. She picked up a book of sermons, and she was surprised to discover how intellectually compelling and complex and profound Christianity really is. The next blow for her atheism came at a faculty dinner. She sat right next to a science professor named Andrew Biggs, who asked if she believed in God. Unsure of how to respond, Sarah said that she was agnostic. He replied, "Do you really want to sit on the fence forever?" That question made her realize that if the question of human equality mattered, she needed to think more deeply about the existence of God. Saying, "I don't know," just wasn't good enough anymore. Sarah left Oxford and she took up a teaching post at Florida State University. And there she met Christians whose lives were deeply shaped by Jesus Christ. They fed the homeless. They ran community shelters. They housed migrant farm laborers. Finally, shortly after her 28th birthday, she walked into a church for the first time, honestly seeking God. And she soon felt overwhelmed. At last, she felt fully known and unconditionally accepted. And she describes her understanding. I don't have that quote on the screen. Yes, I do. That's the one. Christianity, it turned out, she writes, looked nothing like the caricature I once held. God wants broken people, not self-righteous ones. Salvation is not about us earning our way to some place in the clouds through good works. On the contrary, there is nothing we can do to reconcile ourselves to God. As a historian, she said, this made profound sense to me. I was too aware of the cycles of poverty and violence and injustice in human history to think that some utopian design of our own, scientific or otherwise, might save us. This woman discovered that the longing for justice that had drawn her to radical leftist ideologies was ultimately more satisfied by the radical message of Jesus Christ, who abandoned his rights and embraced suffering and humiliation and death in order to serve others. She writes, to live as a Christian is a call to be part of this new radical creation. I am not passively awaiting a place in the clouds. I am redeemed by Christ, and so now I have work to do. Sarah's deep-seated belief in human equality and her desire for justice left her unsatisfied with atheism. She was morally homesick for a place that she had not known. Paul Offit is a professor of pediatrics and vaccinology at the University of Pennsylvania. And he came to a similar conclusion in his own experiences. He had good reason to think that religion hindered morality. Back in 1991, a measles-like epidemic swept through Philadelphia. Hundreds of children got sick. 9 of them died. Dr. Offit was an attending physician at the Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. But what differentiated these measles-stricken patients from other sick kids was how unnecessary the deaths were, because 2 Philadelphia churches, whose adjoining schools educated hundreds of children, had refused vaccination and medical care for their kids. And so the disease took hold and it spread. And it influenced Dr. Offit to believe that Christianity hinders science, morality. And that was one incident among several that prompted Dr. Offit to write a book titled Bad Faith: How Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine. Being non-religious, he assumed that he would sound the same themes that had been sounded by other militant atheists like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Christopher Hitchens and some others that you've probably heard of, that religion is illogical and it's potentially harmful. But Dr. Offit was honest enough, unlike many critics of the Bible, to actually open up the Bible and read it himself. And when he did, his mind was changed. Jesus' advocacy for children moved him to tears. And he writes, Independent of whether you believe in the existence of God, you have to be impressed with the man described as Jesus of Nazareth. At the time of Jesus' death, around 4 BC to 30 AD, child abuse, as noted by historians, was the crying vice of the Roman Empire. Infanticide was common. Exposure, as I mentioned before. Abandonment was common. Hippocrates, who lived about 400 years before Jesus, often wrote about how physicians should ethically interact with patients. But Hippocrates never mentioned children. And that's because children were property, no different than slaves. But Jesus stood up for children, cared about them, when those around him typically didn't. Today, Dr. Offit describes Christianity as the single greatest breakthrough against child abuse in human history, observing, among other things, that the Christian emperor of the Roman Empire outlawed infanticide in 315 AD and provided a nascent form of welfare in 321 AD so poor families would not have to sell their kids because they couldn't feed them. Ultimately, Dr. Offit changed the subtitle to his book, Bad Faith, How Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine, to When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine, acknowledging the massive impact that Christianity has had on medicine and ethics. The point I'm trying to emphasize is that you can't base morality on atheism. It is absolutely impossible. Despite the historical handprints of Christianity on everything today, from human rights to pediatric medicine, people still think we would be better off in our world with some common morality grounded in secular beliefs instead of in the nature and teachings of Jesus Christ. But there's problems with that. The population of the world is overwhelmingly religious. The number of atheists in the world are a distinct minority. If the world were a single democracy in which every human being had a vote and we ask this electorate to nominate a belief system that would be the foundation for our moral beliefs, Christianity would win overwhelmingly. It would also represent the most diverse coalition in countries around the world and on every continent. So why would we seek to build a global morality on atheism when it represents a relatively small proportion of the world's population, concentrated primarily in people living in communist countries? And the second problem is the one we have on the screen. In 2012, Duke philosophy professor Alex Rosenberg addressed a series of questions from an atheist perspective in this book, The Atheist Guide to Reality, Enjoying Life Without Illusions. Question: is there a God? Rosenberg's answer: no. What is the nature of reality? What physics says it is. What is the purpose of the universe? There is none. What is the meaning of life? Ditto. There is none. Why am I here? Rosenberg answers: just plain dumb luck. Does prayer work? Of course not. Let me give you an aside. Duke University is well known for presenting studies on how prayer influences healing. Same university where he's teaching atheism. Does prayer work? Of course not. Is there a soul? Is it immortal? His answer is: are you kidding? Question: is there a free will? Notice what he says: not a chance. What happens when we die? Everything pretty much goes on as before except us. What's the difference between right and wrong, good and bad? His answer: there is no moral difference between them. Question: why should I be moral? Answer: because it makes you feel better than being immoral. Question: is abortion, euthanasia, suicide, paying taxes, foreign aid, or anything else you don't like forbidden, permissible, or sometimes obligatory? His answer: anything goes. You see, that's the bottom line when you try to base morality on atheism. Anything goes. Now, I would assume that Rosenberg would not agree with that question and answer pamphlet that I read earlier from ISIS, but his position allows it. According to the moral answers he derives simply from atheism, there is a straightforward answer to every question. Is it permissible to have intercourse with a female slave who has not reached puberty? His answer would have to be, anything goes. Alan Lightman is an MIT professor, popular science writer. He articulates his agnosticism this way. He says, our consciousness and our self-awareness create an illusion that we are made out of some special substance, that we have some kind of special ego power, some I-ness, some unique existence. But in fact, we are nothing but bones and tissue and gelatinous membranes and neurons and electrical impulses and chemicals. Now, he's being honest, refreshingly honest. But if science is all we have, our sense of self is just an illusion, and we have no moral agency. Morality is no more than just a preference. We're a bunch of atoms, like trees, like donuts. This professor continues. So eat a donut, eat a child. Anything goes. Lightman is not alone in this voice crying in the wilderness for the abandonment of a concept of self. Sam Harris is one of those popular new atheists. He wrote a book back in 2012 called Free Will. And he writes that free will is no more than a delusion. He says that the idea that we as conscious beings are deeply responsible for the character of our mental lives and subsequent behavior is simply impossible to map onto reality. Neither Lightman nor Harris draws the moral conclusion that anything goes, but again, their position allows it. Why not? In this understanding of humanity, is it an inevitable outworking of science? Not at all. There's another MIT professor, a world-class plasma physicist named Ian Hutchinson, and he writes in a book, I am an assembly of electrons and quarks interacting through quantum chromodynamics and the electroweak forces. And I have no idea what he's talking about. I am a heterogeneous mixture of chemical elements. I am a system of biochemical processes guided by genetic codes, but I am also a vast and astounding complex organism of cooperating cells. I am a mammal with hair and warm blood. I am a person, husband, lover, father, and I am a sinner saved by grace. You see, science doesn't require us to become atheists. He started following Jesus when he was an undergraduate at King's College in Cambridge. Some argue that selfishness is just a natural result of evolution. The problem is that there is no genetic code that forces us to be selfless. And so the idea that we are selfless just because evolution requires it also has no scientific backing. Steven Pinker writes, does God have good reason for designating certain acts as moral and others as immoral? If not, his dictates are divine whims. Why should we take them seriously? And if, on the other hand, God was forced by moral reasons to issue some dictates and not others, if a command to torture a child, for example, was never an option, then why not appeal to those reasons directly? In other words, either God decides what's good, in which case good is capricious based on God's whims, or there's something above God that is forcing him to decide if something is good. But Pinker misunderstands the nature of biblical teaching. What is good? It's what flows out of the nature of God. It's the nature of God that dictates what's good, not something else outside of God. So Christianity claims that the God who created the stars and the galaxies also created you and me for a special relationship with Him. And the same God calls us to a radical, selfless, self-giving love that overflows from His own heart that was selfless and that gave His Son for us. Faith in a loving, rational God who created humans in His image and calls us to love our neighbors and our enemies. That is not only the historical source of our beliefs in human equality, but it's also their best justification for treating each other with dignity and with respect. Now, Christians, you and I know that we can't make any claim to some kind of innate moral superiority. We can't dictate how people are to live just because of who we are. It's because of who Jesus is. And to be a Christian is to acknowledge our utter moral failure in trying to live right, and to throw ourselves at the feet of a merciful God and find mercy and grace to help us in time of need, based on our relationship with God through His Son, the only truly, inherently good man who has ever lived. There's only one way that we can have a morality that has any internal consistence to it, and that's the morality that comes from the nature and the teachings of Jesus Christ. I hope these ideas that I've presented here this afternoon can help you perhaps in your discussions with those in your sphere of influence who need understanding when it comes to how we are to treat one another. If we can help you tonight in your walk with Jesus Christ, let us know as we stand and sing.